Morning, everyone. We're just going to let people trickle in here a little bit before we get started. Happy Friday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are.
Sorry, guys.
Do it a few more seconds.
Oh, let me turn this little guy off.
Okay, we can probably, BJ, once you're done with your phone, we can probably get started. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be together again. So a couple things. So today, a couple reminders. For reminders, if you've been here before, new info for those of you who haven't, welcome if you're new. By the way, the setup for these things, guys, is informal. We'll start by going through some basics on the topic, and then we'll open it up for questions. We'll talk about that in a second, but the spirit of these things is informal, is light. We're all human beings trying to figure things out. So ask anything, say anything within the sort of basic precepts of morality and lawfulness, and be kind, and that's about it. But before we go any further, let me introduce my dear friend Dani Chammas. So Dani and I go way back. I don't know what year. I guess you were a med student.
Med student, yeah.
So awesome. So Dani, Dani is one of my favorite all-time people and clinicians. She's a person, when I left UCSF, she now sees a lot of the patients I used to see, and it tickles me to know that they're in her care. Dani is a psychiatrist by training and palliative care doc by training, and just all around awesome, thoughtful, lovely person who also makes beautiful art, as you'll see on some of our slides. And she also writes children's books. She's a mom. She's many, many wonderful things. Anyway, Dani, thank you for joining us. It's really nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's cut over to you, Sonia, here in a second. Yeah, take it away.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to let you know how to interact with us after BJ and Dani have gone through the level setting slides. So once they've done that, we will open it up for your questions and comments. And you can do this in two ways. You can click the raise hand button and we will unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. Or if you'd prefer to not do that, you can just type your question into the Q&A area and I will read it aloud for Dani and BJ to address it. So again, two ways: you can raise your hand, ask it verbally, or type it into the Q&A and I can read it for you. And to BJ's note about a safe space, if you would like to remain anonymous, that's no problem. Please just let me know in the Q&A area and I will be sure not to mention your name. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Mama. Okay. Well, so this talk is, I wonder if it'll register as very familiar to you guys right out of the chutes, but it is a lot of people, patients, family, people I deal with in my own life, whatever. We often spend a lot of time in this sort of what feels like a netherworld. And if you're living with a chronic illness, especially one that might end your life someday, it can feel like a kind of words that come up, things like purgatory or no man's land or the space in between. It feels like, is it the world of the living or the world of the dying? And it can often feel like very much like two different worlds and you're in between them, which can be really inherently difficult. It's inherently sort of unmoored. You're not sure where and whether you belong, and all sorts of big questions come up. So first of all, it's just to kind of name this place, because I think I see it in myself and others, a lot of people who go a little bit mad trying to reconcile the way they feel internally with what they see externally. Yeah, it's the same world. I'm in the same place. I'm in the same clothes, but boy, do I feel different. Or maybe people treat me a little differently now that I'm disabled or whatever it is. And I think one of the things that we're hell bent on is sort of demanding or insisting or trying to find a way to see this as one world. It's not the world of the sick or the world of the well. That these are in fact actually the same. It's the same world, despite how it feels sometimes. So part of the reason underneath this talk is to give this some space and breath and to name this place so that we can integrate it with the rest of life, the rest of shared reality. So that's the kind of setup. Dani, anything you want to chime in there, or should I move on?
Yeah, no, I would just say, as I'm listening to you talk about this in-between place, I think a big piece of it is the level of uncertainty that people with serious illness have to live with, right? Like, how do we hold that and tolerate that and manage that? I think it is truly one of the hardest things that we ask people to do when they're seriously ill. I know I, for one, really struggle with uncertainty because it exposes how vulnerable we are.
Right on.
And it's not something we like to feel.
No, despite its outrageous truthfulness, which we'll talk about a little bit more.
We'll talk about it. Yeah, I know. I think in some ways people are sort of walking down a path in such the thick fog, we can't see what's 3 feet ahead of us, right? And that not knowing sometimes is worse than any outcome. Is it going to be a cliff? Is it going to be a meadow? I don't know, but how do I keep walking this path in a way that doesn't feel like torture?
Yeah, right on. And I think maybe some of you guys will register with this, like whether it's waiting for test results or something else, it's almost like the uncertainty becomes sometimes less bearable than sort of the worst news. Like I've met many people who are relieved to get the news that it's metastasized or whatever else, because they've been living in fear of that happening and uncertainty around it. Just tell me whatever it is and I'll deal with it. It's the not knowing that can be so difficult.
Yeah. And not to, I mean, I think this is the next slide, but I think you were getting at this idea that uncertainty is sort of, it's a fundamental part of humanity, right? It's true for all of us. None of us knows what's waiting for us tomorrow. And yet most of us are able to go through our lives holding on to, as the slide says, this myth of certainty, this myth of control, right? And they're intoxicating, these myths, right? They're not easy to relinquish. I walk through my life most of the time assuming that I'm going to see my kids graduate from high school, because there's only so long that I can tolerate the incredibly painful thought that maybe I won't. And yet I think when we are family members facing a serious illness, we don't really have the luxury of living with that mind state as much, because we're just perpetually forced to look head on at our own vulnerability in the world.
Mm-hmm. Right on. And I think it's worth noting, at least it's like comforting to me and some folks I work with, is to name the truthfulness of this place. Like you're calling out, this is a myth. And this myth allows many of us to get through our day. We rely on it unimpeded much of the time, or we'll do all sorts of things to deny anything that challenges that myth. Denial is related to this, of course. So, but as a disabled person or someone who's sick sometimes or whatever else, you may be made to feel like you're the one who's off. And the rest of the world is just doing its thing and it's predictable and it's stable, and you're the one who's not. Well, maybe it's useful to you or maybe it's not, but I find it helpful to realize that the uncertainty is actually the more truthful place. Like you said, Dani, no, we don't know what's coming tomorrow. We don't know what's coming today. We don't, there are probabilities and patterns we can recognize and templates, points of view we can kind of force on our reality. But the truth is nothing's certain. We just don't know a ton. And we just don't like to hang out in that truthy spot. But in case it's of some value to you, I think it's helpful to realize that when you're in that place of uncertainty, you're in a very truthful, real place.
Yeah, you're hanging out with like the expert Buddhist monks at that point, right?
Right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
by force or by choice, we kind of find our way to the truth of that.
Yeah. And I think there's a beauty to it, right? I think sometimes when ourselves or our loved ones gets a pretty serious diagnosis, it does sort of break us a little bit. I think our initial hope is almost always to put the pieces back together, exactly as they used to be. And yet we can't, right? We're fundamentally changed by these experiences. And there is, I don't mean to make it a positive reframe, it's terrible, but there also is a level of beauty and wisdom and perspective that comes with being in touch of this fundamental piece of humanity. It's one of the ways that I think that the recreation of putting your pieces back together is sometimes more beautiful than what it was in the first place. So.
Amen. I love that point, Dani. And it's also points to the sort of wisdom of falling apart.
Yeah.
There's something, I think that's a lot of what we do in palliative care is in some ways we help people fall apart, or provide some place to land. So yeah, falling apart so that you can see all the made up things, and then you can recreate from there. So yeah, not necessarily fun, but powerful. And you're also pointing to like beauty and terror are right next to each other. Those things are not, I think a lot of us might presume they're on opposite ends of some spectrum, but in fact, I think they're really right next to each other.
That's right. I just had a patient this past week in clinic, and it was my first time meeting her, and she came in saying she was in remission now, but her world had been so shaken. And she said, I need you to help me find a way to regain the sense of control that I had. And by the end of the session, we were thinking, well, should we instead shift our goal to being a way to integrate the sort of fundamental truth that I'm vulnerable? And she resonated with that. But then the last question we talked about was, is that a beautiful thought or is that a petrifying thought? And we left it on that, but I think you're right.
Both.
Yeah, it was both.
Yeah, beautiful.
I think we just hit the next slide already. I think we just did it.
Geez, sorry. All right.
Mental note, give me slide control next time, BJ.
No problem, Dani. I will cede control to you any old time. Well, anything else more to say about this?
Not so much. Just I think we already hit it, but I think you actually even started getting us into the next one, which is a little bit about, we talk a lot in palliative care about holding dialectics, right? Holding two seemingly opposing things as true at the same time without either one of them, invalidating the other one. Hopes and fears, right? Darkness and light, connection and loss. There's spoken and unspoken. And I truly think that one of the hardest psychological tasks that we ask of patients and families with serious illness is integrating that dialectic of living well while also acknowledging our vulnerability and our mortality. How do you do both at once? How do you not live in a place of denial or despair, but sort of put those two together?
I wish someone had taught me that earlier in life, because I always felt like I needed to square what am I happy or am I sad? I didn't need to be one or the other. And I don't know when this finally crept into my consciousness, but thank God it did. It made me feel a lot more expansive and a lot more sane. By the way, Dani, can you help us understand the word dialectic versus a duality or anything else?
Dialectic. I mean, in my mind, the dialectic is two things that seemingly are on opposite sides of a pole. They look like they're completely opposing, and yet in actuality, they need one another to exist, right? They're actually not opposing. They exist because of each other and simultaneously with each other. I think the biggest dialectic we talk a lot about is hopes and fears. We talk about that one a lot, right? You can't really have a fear if you don't have a hope. If you don't have a hope, there's nothing to lose.
Right on.
Right. And you can't really have a hope if you don't have a fear. Right
on. Right. I think, yeah. And I guess the difference of versus duality of two things, dialectic is pointing to this potential of any one thing that it contains these what appear like opposites, or like what's our motto in the US? E pluribus unum, like from many one. So our dialectics are the opposite. e unum pluribus, like from one many, something like that. But the point is, you as a single thing can contain these multitudes. It's not necessarily, it's different from being at odds with oneself or someone else.
Yeah, probably the most, I think it was, I'm trying to remember whose paper it was, but I think it was Vicki Jackson. She had a paper and it had a picture of a pendulum, and it talked about how people cope, and how sometimes we think people are squarely on one side, denial, or squarely on the other side. But in actuality, most people's coping is that they're swinging back and forth all the time, back and forth. They're in touch with both sides so frequently, sometimes multiple times in one visit. And I think that the more people are in touch with both sides and looking at both sides, the better they, process, was the argument of the paper. But
I agree. I mean, it seems like whether dealing with illness or just adult life,
living,
have to find a way. Otherwise, you can feel crazy, like you're swinging between these states, and that you are getting lost in the swing, versus kind of holding a space that allows for you to swing within it, like it's the same space.
Yeah.
You get to have both. You have to have both, maybe even.
I like how we're getting kind of meta, but then I think the next slide will pull us a bit more concrete.
Okay,
Coping.
Well, yeah.
Do you want me to take the first stab?
Yeah.
Gosh, when I think about coping, I think we really have to divorce ourselves from the idea that there is one right way to cope with things. Right. We know that our coping mechanisms are a product of a lifetime of experiences and living and relationships. And there just isn't one way you should cope, right? There isn't one way you should do any of this stuff. And at the same time, we know that when we get a serious medical illness, it threatens our sense of security in the world in a way that can really disrupt our, psychological integrity of self, and make it a lot harder for us to access our more adaptive coping that we might have grown accustomed to. So I think there's a really big piece of this for knowing yourself, right? Anything on this list might be what helps you the most. Is it connection? Is it hobbies? Is it humor? Gratitude, mindfulness, narratives? We can read through the whole thing. Meaninglessness. I think you were going to bring up legacy.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, humor specifically, I find that we get a lot of good use out of absurdity. Humor is, can be distracting, can be an icebreaker, can be many things, but it can also be like deeply truthful. And sometimes it's just it's helpful to feel kind of silly, like what is this all about? What are we doing, and why are we doing it? And I don't know, I have just found a lot of potency in just a healthy sense of the absurd. Allows you to move around within it and still laugh at it and take it seriously, but also to laugh at yourself within it. Anyway, I think there's something very beautiful about that. Gratitude.
Oh, you go.
No, sorry, Mama, you go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say, gratitude's come up a lot lately with folks I've been talking to. But I've also noticed it's almost like they feel pressure to feel thankful. Like they don't feel grateful. They feel like shit or whatever else. They feel like that they don't want to be here, and yet they're kind of trying to force a sense of gratitude on top of it and imposing it. And I guess from my money, from what I've seen, gratitude is an amazing, beautiful, wonderful adapting a response to life, but it also kind of requires a genuineness. I mean, I think keeping an eye out for where we can be grateful, biasing ourselves towards it, seeking it. But I think it's also really important to be honest. I think so much of what we're talking about here is just actually being honest with the situation. And so gratitude's beautiful, but it really kind of requires the sense of actually feeling grateful. Does that make sense to you too, Dani? Absolutely.
I think it's the authenticity that you're speaking to. And I think what it is on just having your feelers up for when you actually have it, those moments where it actually comes in, and knowing to slow down enough to savor those moments, because we string those together and they pull us through, even if there's a void for quite a while without much gratitude.
Right.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, I was also going
And
to come.
I was just gonna add, like, I think authenticity reads with all of these, right?
Yeah,
There's no authentic version of the world where, running 5 miles is going to be on my adaptive coping list. Like, it's just not, it would be on my torture list, right? But there are other things that would make it. And that's okay, right? That's okay. There's not one way to do it.
right on. Amen. And it's nice to have a sort of a menu, things to try, but check in with yourself. Is it actually helping? Is it actually serving you? I think that's really right on your, it's key on all of these things. I mean, spirituality, faith is a version too. Faith comes up a lot, but faith also requires some doubt, that you've played around with doubt. The other half, that particular dialectic.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, make a comment, make a plug for meaninglessness.
I should make my plug for meaning, and then you can counter it with your plug for
Great.
meaninglessness.
Go first, girl.
I think for a lot of us, and for a lot of my patients and their families, finding some kind of meaning in their experience does help, right? Some of them put it into just great legacy, great perspective, just so many different things where they can find meaning in what they've gone through. And so I don't want to belittle how helpful that is for people. And having said that, I will let you plug the opposite end.
Mm-hmm. Well, back to this as dialectic, like for meaning to have meaning, we have to retain meaninglessness. So there's just the sort of fun rhetorical-ish kind of conceptual thing. But beyond that, I think it's, if I just think about where I get reinvigorated in a daily way, and it's very often doing things that, maybe the better word is purposelessness, that don't serve a purpose, like playful, like play. What is more, like, with your kiddos, Dani, like, you must see the power of play. Play happens when you feel safe. You could say that there's a health benefit to play, but play seems to me like what makes it play is it's not strategic. It doesn't have a point. It just feels good and right in the doing of it. And that just reminds you that you're alive. If it has any higher purpose, great, but that's kind of incidental. It's like artwork. It exists for its own sake. If you can make a beautiful tea mug, it could be a work of art by some level, and you could also use it practically. But as a piece of art, as an aesthetic object, it seems to me that its poignancy is that it exists for its own sake, not a means to some other end.
Well, I like that word when you said purposeless, because it's interesting. All these examples that you're giving of meaninglessness, I would say, are the things that bring the most meaning to my life, yes. Right? Like those totally pointless afternoons with the kids making bubbles or whatever.
Yeah, so. You're right on. I should watch my language. I think purposelessness is really the better word here. And where it still works too is, we may do things often and we're not sure of the meaning, whether it has meaning, or the meaning is something that we can kind of provide by virtue of it being significant to us, that invests it with meaning. But if there's this sort of hunt for some greater meaning in the universe, I don't know that, at least in my experience, I don't always get to know what the meaning of something is, and yet I can still participate in it and yet still love it.
I'm gonna go with Steve Jobs. It was my graduation speech, actually. He made that point, like the dots won't connect looking forwards, right? They'll only connect looking backwards. But
right on.
Yeah.
That guy was smart, wasn't he?
not BJ Miller level, but he's all right.
Dani Chammas level. Jeez. Anyway, okay. Anything more to?
Well, I think we had pulled out a separate slide, on mindfulness, because I think mindfulness is so relevant to this topic, right? Because we're talking about, we're in sort of this purgatory state. One of the only options is to be present in our moment. So we pulled out an extra slide for this to talk about it a little more. And I had this art teacher, BJ, in college. I had him as a teacher before I even had you. And he told us, he said, one of the hardest things to do in art is to make something that is, quote, simple but not simplistic. And he gave me this torturous assignment to create a piece of art that was simple but not simplistic. And I still haven't totally forgiven him for that. But I have thought a lot in my life about this idea of simple but not simplistic. And I think that mindfulness, right, is sort of the ultimate example of this, right? The idea being fully, present and non-judgmental with whatever it is that we're experiencing in the moment. It sounds so simple. And yet for any of us who've tried to do it, we learn very quickly that it's far from simplistic, right? And for me personally, I mentioned to you the other day, but the passengers on the bus metaphor by Stephen Hayes, he was the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy, has been a really powerful metaphor for me in my life. So I thought I would quickly share it just in case it resonates with anybody who's on the call right now. But for anyone who's unfamiliar, the basic idea is that you imagine that your life is like a bus, right? And you are the driver of this bus. And the road ahead represents all of the things that we encounter from the outside world. So pandemics, illnesses, scans, any number of things. While the passengers on the bus represent all the internal experiences happening within us, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions. And we can hear them, the passengers back there while we're driving. And sometimes they're kind of mumbling softly, but other times they're screaming, right? And when they get like too loud and too intense, our job isn't to start fighting with them, right? If we start fighting with them and trying to kick them off the bus, they're just going to start getting louder. They're going to get more intense. But our job is also not to let their sort of loud, powerful voice take over and dictate where we drive our bus, right? At the end of the day, the passengers, our feelings, our thoughts, they're going to ebb and flow in volume and intensity. And our only job is just to accept whatever passengers happen to have stepped on our bus in this given moment, right? While still maintaining control of the wheel. And I think about it all the time. I was playing a board game with my kids the other day, and this huge wave of anxiety hit me seemingly out of nowhere. And it was really, really unpleasant. And my instinct was to do anything to stop that feeling. And so I did. I took a deep breath and I pictured to the bus, and I said to that very uncomfortable feeling in my chest, I said, all right, like, hi, anxiety. Looks like you're on my bus right now. Feel free to take a seat. You're not the most pleasant passenger, but I'm still the driver of this bus right now. And I'm choosing to play a board game with my kids, right? You can join my team. You're on my team. And in this way, I use the metaphor to sort of tolerate its presence without fighting it or being drowned by it, just sort of accepting, for better or for worse, this is what's on my bus right now. So I don't know. I think when you face serious illness, on some level, like fear, insecurity, frustration, it's just going to come sometimes, and there's no stopping it. So we have to find ways to ride the wave.
Right on. And amen. It will come. There's no shame in that. There's no, fear. All these things are just normal, part of the deal. What you do with them, of course, how you respond to them is so much where the action is. I mean, that's what Muffin thinks. So, but what you're pointing to, Dani, is importantly different from, that's not quite the same thing as control. Driving the bus, keep your hands on the wheel, etc. That it's not the same thing as like shushing that anxiety, or keeping your hand on the wheel is not the same thing as controlling it per se.
Yeah, we don't have the right to refuse which customers get on our bus.
Right.
They just came, and it doesn't, accepting who's on the bus doesn't mean you enjoy them, right? I'm sure that some bus rides are going to be more pleasant by virtue of who's here, and some are going to be less pleasant, and that's okay. Some feelings are really unpleasant, but they are what they are.
It feels like this is essential to the degree that, without just always looking for silver linings, but the degree to which living with illness can benefit us. It seems to have something to do with it. It has potential to blow out the walls and make a bigger sort of capacity, a bigger catchment to tolerate or to explore a wider array of feelings, a wider array of experiences. Again, like you're saying, not always fun or pleasant, but bigger, more complete, more integrated.
Very human.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is where illness is not, it's something that's going to make your life, like all the languaging we've talked about on this webinar so many times around the language around disability, everything, the language of illness sort of implies that now your life is worth less, it is less, you can do fewer things. It's all kind of framed around what you no longer can do. it doesn't get so much attention as what it provides you, what it offers you, and the wisdom it can help evince in a person.
If I had a dime for the amount of times that I've had a patient say, just the other day, someone was saying, time really feels of the essence to me right now. And I wish I could go back to my younger self and let them know that, right? Like if they could pass some of that wisdom on backwards.
Right on. It's our good luck, isn't it, Dani, to go work with folks who may be farther down the path than we are ourselves. We get all these vicarious reminders.
Oh God, yeah. Patients give me way more than I give them. I mean, I don't say that to them usually, but it's true. I see patients on Thursday. I'm totally enlightened on Friday. And then by Saturday, the stuff that everybody's forced to sit with, it's actually hard to sit with. By Saturday, I lose perspective because there's a beauty and a pain to the
Right on.
I'm digressing. Let's move forward.
No, but that's a beautiful thought. I mean, I appreciate that notion too. And it also points out, no matter how many times we think about these things or deal with it or live these lessons out, we are moving in and out. We forget, we remember, we forget. I think that's a nice note, because otherwise I'll feel really bad for forgetting a lesson I've already learned, which I do all the time. Okay, let's see here.
Balanced emotional diet. I have a friend and colleague, close friend, Carrie Brenner, and she was talking to me recently about this idea of a balanced emotional diet, which I think is done from some of the work that Joan Halifax has done about emotional balance. But the idea being that sometimes we have to take a step back and look at our diet as a whole and just be really mindful of what we're choosing to put in ourselves, right? What nourishes our emotional beings, what fills our bucket versus what kind of exhausts or drains or depletes us emotionally. For me personally, there's only so much time I can spend on Google or social media before it starts to take a toll on my mindset. I have to put limits on how much of that I can put in my diet, right? Whereas, having a chit chat with BJ Miller on a Friday morning, that's pretty consistently going to be buffering of my psyche, right? That's going to fill my bucket. So I do think we have the responsibility to step back and sort of look at the inputs as a whole that we're choosing to put in.
Right on. And by extension of that, you mean sort of also make decisions of where we spend our time and with whom? And sometimes in my life, I find myself really unable to let go of miseries for some reason. I feel really attached to my miseries, and I catch myself, and sometimes I don't let good stuff in, which is on me. I'll get us farther off a field, but it's just sort of this feeling of sometimes with myself and others I work with, we stay a little too close to misery so we don't forget. And so when the next bad thing that happens, we won't be taken by surprise. It's sort of a vigilance, but it can crowd out a lot of this. Yeah. And it can crowd out a lot of the celebratory moments. And if we're really, to your point here, I think one thing I need to work on is letting the good stuff in too, letting that fill our tank too, rounding out the experience. So, all right, shall I move on?
We should make an emotional diet food pyramid.
Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. I smell up paper, Dani.
It's too funny. Let's move on to the last one so we can also get to questions.
Yeah.
I love this. My about to turn 7-year-old drew this picture. So thanks for putting it in. She'll be stoked to hear about it. But for me personally, if there was a take home from this chat, it would be that I think the number one muscle that we all have to work on flexing, but particularly if we're facing a serious illness, is self-compassion, right? Of course, the experience of a serious illness is, and the experience of deep uncertainty is hard, right? It's almost impossibly hard sometimes, but how could it not be? So we're associated with that, right? Of course, we deserve understanding and non-judgment and love and compassion. And yet, why is it so hard to offer these things to ourselves when we give it so willingly to others? I took my 2-year-old on a scoot on Wednesday, and she was working her way down the sidewalk at a snail's pace, mind you. But she was saying to herself over and over, "I doing great, I doing great, I doing great." And it was beautiful, but it was actually really shocking to me because it seemed so foreign. It seemed almost alien to imagine having such a kind inner voice towards myself. And I found myself thinking, gosh, did I have that once? Right? Like, at what age did life suck that out of me? You know, if only we could all stumble down the sidewalk at a snail's pace in this life and be telling ourselves things with that much kindness and self-compassion. I don't know.
Are you, do you mind sharing? Are you working? Is it coming? Are you getting back to that voice in yourself about it?
It's a work in progress for me. It really is. It's one of those easier said than done, simple but not simplistic things. I talk to patients every day about the idea of self-compassion, and yet my gut, just my go-to is to be really harsh. And I've been trying to catch it when I do it to myself and be increasingly mindful of it. And I think two things that have helped me when I see myself totally beating my own self up is either A, picturing myself as a kid, like the kid version of myself, or picturing myself as a friend, and really, really trying to think, like, what would I say to this person right now? Because it's almost always so much kinder, but it's not natural for me. It's a skill that I've been trying to practice and flex, and maybe one day I'll be great at it.
I'm so with you. I wonder where do we absorb this?
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm with you. I really struggle with this one too. And sometimes I'm okay at it. And sometimes I'm really just, it feels like it's some trick I learned earlier in life to kind of, as a leverage to wring more out of myself. If I'm not satisfied, if I don't like myself, I'll try harder or something like that. I don't know.
And yet, BJ, when you see a patient or a client beating themselves up, there's not even, I would guess, a piece of you that wants to jump on that bandwagon. You probably
right.
so quickly.
Right.
You know,
We're such hypocrites. I mean, really, there's a weird double standard in there. I'm not sure. I'd love to know the source of how that happens, but it certainly happens. And I'm like you, a work in progress on this. But, okay. Well, shall we?
let's open it up.
Yeah.
I feel like there's been I keep seeing chats pop in, like, I'm on Team Meaningless, or what's BJ's cat's name? And I feel like I missed the party a little bit.
Well, yeah, but see, I haven't looked at the chat either. Ooh, there's a lot in there.
A lot of people who want to turn the bus around, Dani. A lot of comments on the bus metaphor. One of the questions that came in when you guys were speaking, this person just said, I love adaptive coping. This is what I do, but my husband and family think they are using, quote, real coping. And then they question my adaptive coping as not good enough or coming from negativity. And why can't I cope better? I just thought that was an interesting concept that maybe you two could comment on.
I mean, I think BJ started to mention this question earlier is, does it serve, right? Does it serve? And I think it's an important one for us to ask ourselves as we're going through, because coping is coping. Like, coping is a neutral concept. Coping is what gets us through. Some of our coping is adaptive. Some of our coping is not adaptive, but it's all we can do to get through. So I think there's a degree of being really willing. It's hard to tackle this, really willing to know yourself, because there's a good chance that what you're doing is what works for you and is what you need to be doing. In which case, the core issue that I'd be hearing in this question is the people around me maybe don't totally get my psyche. They don't get how I cope and how it's different than how they cope. And there's some really beautiful work that can be done there. The flip side is sometimes the people around us know us better than we know ourselves, and maybe they're pointing out something that's really important for us to look at as well. I don't know, BJ, if you have other.
Well, that's beautiful. I love that. That sounds so nice. I guess. So how do we define adaptive? What constitutes adapt? I mean, because implied in the question, and it's all over the place. We're judging ourselves and each other.
That's true.
That's another human thing. So when do we get to say something is adaptive or maladaptive?
That's funny. The fellows always ask me that question when I bring up adaptive coping. I do think it really comes down to, is this helping me to process? Mm-hmm. Right? Is this helping me to process? I could go so many places with this. I have some patients who will ask so many minutia details, like so many. And with one patient asking a bunch of questions, in my head, I'm thinking, this is helping them process. This is giving them something to hold on to. This understanding is really helpful. And I will sit with them for an eternity answering the questions. And I can have another patient doing the exact same behavior, right? They're asking all these detailed questions, but in my head, I get the sense that it's helping them not look at the big picture. It's helping them not touch something really fundamental that they should be touching, but they don't want to. And so we're sort of deflecting together. And so I give this as an example just to say it's the same behavior, and it can be adaptive or not adaptive. And so I think we just have to be really true with ourselves. Is this helping me process? There's almost nobody for whom, drinking so much that you black out drunk and feel numb and vomit and wake up the next day, like that's squarely not adaptive coping, right? And there are other things that I would say are almost always going to be adaptive coping. But I think a lot of times we're in the gray, and we just sort of be as honest as possible with ourselves if what we're doing is
Right.
helping us process.
Well, and I like how you're pointing as one of the arbiters of this is your own sort of gut sense. Does this feel right? Is it serving?
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, what else is out there, Sonia?
Yeah, some really good ones. This person said, I'm obsessed with the thought that I'm doing it wrong. When I'm away from my mom, I feel guilty. When I'm with her, it's painful. I'm always thinking I should be doing more. Am I not trying hard enough to help her, etc.? How can I stop feeling so obsessed with these feelings?
I don't know who you are, but I want to give you a hug. I think we share the same psyche a little bit. BJ, you look like you were going to say something, so I'll let you go first.
No, please.
I resonated with a feeling like I could see myself getting lost in this hole. And it's so sad, right? Because the mental energy that we put to that's probably the only wasted mental energy, right? That's sort of the only mental energy I want to save you from spending. Have you guys, so Donald Winnicott, he was this old historical British pediatrician and psychoanalyst, and he was famous for a lot of things and holding spaces and stuff like that, but he was famous for this idea of a good enough mother, right? That people don't need a great mother, they don't need an outstanding mother, they need a good enough mother. And I actually have a picture of Winnicott on my fridge because I so frequently struggle with the same thing that you're describing, obviously in a different setting. This is like, am I being a good enough mom for them, or, doing well enough by them? And I just have to repeatedly remind myself, I just have to be good enough, that probably what I'm doing is just fine. And I think when we strive for the perfection, like the whole, don't let perfection be the enemy of good, gets in our way a little bit.
Yeah, it's a doozy. I mean, part of me wants to just say, when I talk to myself about the same sort of impulse to judge constantly, just a gnarly judge of myself. Am I doing this right? Am I doing this? Is this good enough? Part of me has reconciled that voice by just saying, well, that voice, it's sort of like back to your bus metaphor. That voice, he's on the bus.
She's on the bus.
That
Self-judgment, she's on the bus, sit on there.
Self-loathing has a seat on the bus almost all the time on my bus. It's always this good. And so part of me just squares it by saying, yeah, okay. And maybe that voice at its best is trying to help me learn. There's something beautiful about learning over time, and that this is all dynamic. And I'll probably die with that voice, looking at what could I have done different? What could I have done better? And for me, that has at least quieted that voice down a little bit. But another thought is, if that judgy question is coming from, am I, because you want to be of service in the world or good to your family or whatever it is, just good, it's a reminder that loving yourself, I don't know if there's a kinder thing that you can do for the world around you than to love yourself.
Put your oxygen mask on first.
Right. And a version of this, love yourself, in other words, not judge yourself, but love yourself, even though you're going to be judging yourself too, or let yourself judge yourself and judge yourself favorably, whatever it is, but find your way to, if that self-doubt, if that questioning is getting in the way of you actually loving yourself. Well, I would say one way is to find some way to accept it so that you can accept yourself, so that you can love yourself. And even if you're doing it wrong, whatever it is, that light that comes from you is what anyone around you would ever need.
Yeah.
That may sound a little pat, but there's something in there. I need to probably play with
I
that
mean,
one.
imagine if we could tell ourselves in that moment, whoever you are out there, like, I'm feeling this because I love them. I love them so much. It's so hard to watch somebody I love suffer that I so badly want to do right by them. And that deep love for them is manifesting in this feeling I'm having. But you know what? Like that's where we give ourselves the hug, you know, and I'm doing my best, and that love is real, and that love is palpable, and all the self-compassion that
Amen.
counts. And I'm so sorry that she's on your bus right now, but
Right on. Noisy. Right on. I think that it feels that way about grief too. Any of the hard feelings, if you see love as a source of the hard feeling, it really helps, I think, accept the feeling. Okay, what else, Sonia? What else?
Yeah, we got quite a few coming in here. Someone just said, if a crisis happens out of the blue and you never know when it will happen, and it happens often, how do you keep from sitting in doom?
You want me to start there? Well, I think it's a matter, for me, there's something around proportionality, of being reminded of, yeah, doom, things go wrong. Yes, the other shoe will drop. Yeah, eventually. But it's sort of back to Dani's dialectic and a sort of a fuller worldview. If you're in touch with, yeah, doom happens, but yeah, beauty happens too. The more you can kind of round out the experience, these end up being sort of a full picture of reality, kind of counterpoints itself. Yeah, it's horrifying. Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, the other shoe's going to drop. Yeah, and there's a lot of things that go right too. It's this constantly kind of pulling back on this lens and seeing a fuller picture, and making sure to look for that, see the beauty too. So for me, one response here is to, yeah, doom. Yeah, makes sense. That's true. And even if you're just trying to prepare yourself for that next doomy moment, well, back to fill your tank, touch in on beauty, touch in on love too. Those are the very things that will actually help you deal with the next doomy moment.
yeah, I feel for the person asking the question, because they're saying doom is coming.
Yeah.
I'm not even sitting with, is doom coming? It's sure, when is it coming? It's coming. And I think the question is, I think on some level, our brain has decided that if I think about the doom enough, it will somehow protect me when it comes.
Yeah.
But what we find time and time again is that it doesn't protect us that much. Like when doom comes, it hurts, and it's going to hurt. And there's nothing that we can do that's going to make it not hurt. And so I agree, this is a place where, as much as we can, because it's not serving, if thinking about the doom kept it away, great, I'll tell you to think about it all day long, but it's not serving. So as much as we can, I'm thinking about the doom. I'm not going to fight that. It's on my best sit down, looming feeling of complete uncomfort in the world. And I'm still going to be writing my best. I'm still going to shift my attention to the things that are going to feed my, emotional diet. I'm still going to play this board game with someone. And I'm not going to let that dictate my life. And I think hopefully the idea is that with more and more of that practice, the ability to be in the present and the ability for it to not ruin the time between now and when doom hits, hopefully gets stronger. But it's simple, but not simplistic. A lot easier said than done.
Amen. And another one of those sort of works in progress. I think inherently. In other words, it's not a space you get to and inhabit and everything's fine from there.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. How are we doing on time? So
Wow.
more?
Yeah, we've got more questions. This person just said, I've been curating my life, deleting certain precancer behaviors and routines, and adding other new, at times related activities to cancer treatment. And people notice these changes, and it's hard for me to say no when I'm being invited to return to my quote, old self, and I don't have the bandwidth to fake it. Cancer or life-limiting illness really does necessitate a new identity.
Dani, do you want to respond, or I got me to jump in?
Jump in.
Well, yeah. That's why I think for me, I think there's something that attractive about these. It, I have been seduced by a more concrete notion of identity, that, and I see it with friends, like you want them to be recognizable, and I watch how close relationships sometimes hold us back because the sort of expectations that we're going to show up in a certain way and be the same guy I was the last time we talked or whatever else. And that sort of constancy is helpful. And I think it's helpful to find the parts of us that don't change. But for my money and from what I've seen, the more and more, I'm just more and more convinced that the therapeutic stuff is really much more around letting yourself be changed, be affected. But that is actually a very beautiful thing that humans do, is we aren't made of stone. We aren't rocks. We are affected by it. We're fleshy, malleable things that move through a world in a dynamic way over space and time. We are changed. And it can be beautiful to, again, to keep an eye out for what doesn't change. I'm all for that too. But it really, the really allowing ourselves, even getting into the idea of being affected, I think is really gorgeous. And on the other end, I've known the reason I have felt when I was a patient, I remember one of the most therapeutic things for me was when nurses or anyone would tell me how they were affected by my experience. It was such a kind offering to me to know that something I was going through moved someone else. And if we let ourselves, we get out of our way, we're moving each other all the time. It can feel a little scary, but there's something really beautiful and truthful about that. There's sort of an emotional dexterity that can happen, and a roving, malleable sense of identity. I am blank. I am many things. I don't know what the hell I am, and that's another work in progress. So anyway, my response to that comment is really to actually to find a way to embrace or get into this mutability, this affecting.
Yeah, I think I agree. We evolve, right? We
Yeah.
evolve. And there are some things about me that will always be there. I will always run anxious, and I will always go to humor. And there are just certain pieces of me that will always be there, but we evolve. And I think one of the hard things about illness, a lot of times we evolve alongside the people around us. And I think one of the hard things about illness that you brought up in the question that's beautiful is that we do a lot of evolving separate from so many pieces of our world. And then we re-enter them a little bit as new people. And I think that, like BJ said, if we're true to ourselves, then the task to look at is, well, okay, how does this relationship evolve now? How does this 2.0 version of me relate to these people? And there's work to be done with that. It's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hey.
Right. Back to you, Sonia.
Yeah. Dani, quick question. Might you be able to go over a couple minutes? I'm just looking at the question you've got. Okay. Not crazy.
That? No, that's from Sonia. Yes. Yes. It's the easiest question of the day.
Okay, perfect. All right. This other question that came in, this person said, can you talk about managing anger and frustration, feeling it and expressing it, but then letting it go without allowing it to emotionally sicken you?
It's a big question. Anger and frustration is a really interesting one because it's a feeling, like every feeling, and it gets its spot on the bus like every feeling. And it's a hard one because it's so hard for the people around us to absorb, right? We can absorb it if our loved one is sad. We can absorb it if our loved one is anxious. We can absorb so much. And it's so hard for our loved ones to absorb our anger and our frustration. Even as a clinician, I have to self-cultivate my ability to absorb someone's anger and frustration, because I know that it's like every other feeling. It deserves its time. It deserves its ability to come out, but it's a hard one for people around you. And so I think really that's the reason that we struggle with this one a little bit, especially because we worry about the impacts on the world around it. And I don't think I have a magical answer to this one, except the two thoughts are: number one, if it's on your bus, it's on your bus, just like any other feeling. It's okay to be angry, and it's okay to be frustrated. And number two, and people say this a lot, people often call anger or frustration a secondary emotion in psychiatry. And the idea being that there's usually something that came first, like that for most of us, something either really hurt us. And some of us get to that secondary emotion so fast that we don't slow it down to see did something make me feel sad? Did something make me feel disrespected? Did something make me feel like unimportant? Like any number of things. I don't know what it is, but I think either with yourself or if you have a therapist or anywhere, slowing it down enough to zoom in on what might have been there right before that kindled that anger and frustration, and giving that a voice and a space at a time when you're not actually feeling angry and frustrated, can be helpful. BJ, I don't know if you.
No, that's so good, Dani. I really love that sound of that. In other words, sort of going into the anger and seeing what's under it. True of so many hard emotions. Actually, the answer often is not avoidance, but going into it and exploring it and seeing what's underneath it. I guess I would only add that it's sort of like a friction thing. I think the trouble is this sort of the friction around these feelings. And so it's sort of like this idea of being affected, like so kind of get out of the way, like drop the resistance. So in other words, letting these feelings come, it makes it easier to let them go too. If you're really kind of dropping the barbs that hang these things out and get us stuck, if you're not getting so exercised trying to keep the feeling at bay, letting it come, it seems to me it's a lot easier to let it go too. You can sort of let it blow through you.
Muffin agrees.
Yeah, Muffin is very clearly.
Muffin really agrees.
Okay, what else, Sonia?
We've got 2 hands up. Susan, thank you for waiting here. You should be talk permitted on your side, and you may just need to, there you go.
Okay.
You there, Susan?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm a clinical social worker, and I work a lot with patients with cancer. And while there seems to be kind of a solution approach to the medical stuff, for example, you're likely to lose your hair with this chemo. Here's what you can do. You might want to cut your hair ahead of time. You might want to investigate a cold cap. There doesn't seem to be here's what to expect on the emotional, spiritual front. And as a therapist, I want to respect my patient's right to self-determination. I want to meet them where they are. I don't want to presume a one-size-fits-all approach. But I wonder often, would patients benefit from a more prescriptive approach rather than leaving them to kind of muddle through? Like, here's what you might expect. And I don't know that, I'll give them the menu, here's what you might try, but are there any resources, or is there a toolkit for the spiritual, the psychosocial piece?
Let's build it, Susan. I don't know if there is, but I love this. Do you know, Dani, are you aware of some ways to sort of prospectively, proactively prepare folks on the emotional plane?
Well, it's so hard because I see exactly what you're getting at, and we don't do a lot proactively in this sphere. And I think the bind, which you're talking about when you say you don't want to presume, is that while sometimes we do see themes amongst people, we don't see it play out the same for a lot of people, right? Sometimes I'll read a chart and I'll go into a meeting and I will be thinking, this is going to be the saddest hour of my life. And the person that I see is like joking and uplifted and, is so at peace, and I'm shocked. And other times I'm going to see someone in remission and I'm ready for a celebration and the person's in a lot of distress. And so it's so hard to do the proactive prescriptive stuff when everybody's experience is so individualized. And yet I think what you're getting at is that if we do nothing, then people are alone on this journey and they don't get it and they're sort of muddling through. And I think there's we could really think about what can we do? Like, even to say to somebody, stuff's going to come up for you. It's going to. Let's set an appointment. I don't have an agenda for this point. Let's set an appointment for this time where we can look at what might come up, because I don't know what's going to come up, but it's going to come up, and it's going to, just that kind of guidance to somebody, so that when it does inevitably come, they're not wondering, am I doing this right? I should be, like, what do I do with this? That we've sort of helped them anticipate that piece.
Yeah.
It's probably a better answer to this question. I'll have to think on it a little bit.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, I'm with you. And Susan, I wonder if this comes up for you. I think I've tried to, say things like this must be so devastating, and I've had people say, well, it wasn't until you said that. So for us to be sort of emotionally available for these potential spaces versus prescriptive is an important distinction. And I think what you're saying, Dani, too, of this idea of, like, without being too specific, just simply saying, hey, I see a lot of folks deal with versions of what you've got, and things are going to come up. This is messy human life, and that's okay. So just like you framed it, I sound so perfect, versus saying fear is going to come up, or anything more specific, just sort of cutting this nice wide berth for people to feel themselves into. I think it may be as prescriptive as we can get. And then I love this idea of proactively setting appointments and say, hey, you can always cancel them, but they're there for us when things start hitting the fan, or if they do, or whatever else.
And I think, I was just going to say, I think what you're also getting at when you bring up this question is that we are trained in medicine to fix things. Like, we fix things. There's an urge to fix. And I think in the healthcare system, there's a very big discomfort that comes when we can't fix, or when things come up when we can't fix it. So I think a part of the problem too is just that the healthcare system is not set up in a way that's really good at holding with patients, accompanying patients down paths that we can't nicely tie up. And so I think sort of culturally as a system, we need to change that, because I think we communicate on a subconscious way to our patients that, like, we don't want your problems that we can't fix. Like, we can't even tolerate them. They're going to make us uncomfortable. You're going to bring them, and I'm going to try to patch them up. And if we could change that, subconscious message that we're sending to people, then maybe they wouldn't feel as alone. Maybe they would start muddling, and they would come to us with that more easily.
I agree with that. There's sort of a cultural overlay. We sort of imply things with our vibes, with the way we are, that life is meant to be perfect, and any detour that's hard is an aberrant thing. Like, what's wrong with you? Life's supposed to be easy and perfect until something's wrong with you. That vibe is all over the place. Anyway, I love your comments, Dani. Susan, before we move off, any reflections, or from your own practice, any thoughts on what we're selling here?
No, I've enjoyed this discussion a whole lot, and got to think about all of it. Thank you, though.
Great, thank you. Sonia, anybody else?
Yeah, we've got one more here. Esther's been waiting very patiently. One sec. Esther, thank you so much for waiting. You should be set up to ask your question now.
Hey, no worries. It's not actually a question, as seems to be my want. I just wanted to shotgun a couple of thoughts in, because it's always very stimulating conversation. Thank you both so much. Just that idea of normalizing whatever comes up for a person when it comes up in the room, and fostering a sense of being open to whatever comes up. I just guess I wanted to third that a little bit. Yeah, a little bit of that. Because it's the beginning of a dialogue. It's the beginning of kind of saying, hey, things are going to happen, and we can be in a place of not knowing, of no mind. And then that opens the door to possibility, which is really along the same lines as that idea of embracing uncertainty. Mm-hmm. That complex thing about embracing uncertainty, the both and. If we're able to sort of foster this idea that maybe even just a sliver, once in a while, with that sense, it opens the door to possibility. And I also just wanted to throw out the idea that we can ponder that maybe there's a difference between certainty and stability. We can't always, certainty, I mean, yes, it doesn't exist. The emperor has no clothes. But stability is possible.
Yeah.
And it's also moves all the time, like everything else. And then just quickly, that idea about the judge, the relentless judge, and the folks on the bus, the aspects of ourselves and who's driving the bus, all those kind of beautiful metaphors. I would maybe posit the idea that it's all adaptive, that it's all adaptive behavior, and that it's somewhere along the lines, maybe it served us, or it's still serving us. Who even knows? Serving is not always a positive, it's not always a happy, positive balloons kind of thing, that it serves us in some way or did. And maybe we get to a point of God acknowledging, and you know what, I don't like this anymore. It's not serving me in a way I want it to serve me. How do I investigate that and start peeling away those layers of that onion? And then we might be able to also stop and look at who's on the bus, that judge, that relentless judge, and have some compassion for them. So we meet the judge, maybe, and maybe not all the time, because it's a practice, right? All of this stuff, it's not a thing we learn. I don't know, do we ever learn lessons, or do we just peel away layers of them? I don't know. But that perhaps we can meet the judge, the thing we think is so loathsome, that's the word, with tenderness.
Yeah.
Because maybe they have something to tell us. Same with anger, same with all this stuff. Often there's information there. Those were a few thoughts that you inspired. Thank you both so much. There's
Esther, I love that. I mean, I loved all of them, so it's hard to respond to all of them, but I loved all of them. And I will self-disclose as a personal journey, because I have a judge in my head that I went from calling her a bully, right? She's the bully in my head, and I'm not going to listen. And slowly over time, just what you're describing, like the more why is she there? Okay, she's there because she was giving me a sense of false control in the world. She was there to, if I could do everything right enough, then nothing terrible would happen, right? At some point, it was serving me to be this perfectionist. It's just not anymore. And slowly over time, she's becoming not a bully, but this like little girl inside of me that was just really scared that the world was out of control. And I haven't quite gotten to the point of giving her a hug yet, but maybe that's going to be the next chapter in my life. But as you were describing it, oh my gosh, it was so beautiful the way you put it. I think it's it's just such a nice addition. Thank you, Esther.
Dani, blessings. Blessings to us all and our child within. Yeah.
Thank you, Esther. You always add so much to these. I love when you chime in. Thank you. Maybe that's the perfect last word. Or Sonia, was there more to dip into, or shall we let?
No, I think that's a beautiful way to end it. Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Dani, you're friggin' awesome. I love you so much. Thank you for
Thanks for
doing
having me.
And thank you guys, everybody out there. It's such a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate everyone participating. So, okay.
Have great weekends, everyone.
Yeah. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.